When an avoidant hurts you, do this instead of reacting, because in that exact moment it feels like something inside you just shifts, like the ground disappears without warning and you're left standing in emotional silence trying to understand how someone who was just close can suddenly feel like a stranger. It usually doesn't start with something dramatic, it starts with distance, a slower reply, a colder tone, a message that doesn't sound like them anymore, or sometimes just complete silence that leaves your mind filling in every possible worst-case scenario. And what makes it so powerful isn't even the event itself, it's the way your body reacts before your logic even gets a chance to speak. Suddenly you're checking your phone more than you should, rereading old messages, trying to find hidden meaning in words that were never meant to confuse you, and without realizing it, you're slipping into a version of yourself that is no longer calm, no longer centered, just reactive. Before anything else, if you've ever felt that pull, the urge to chase clarity when someone pulls away, just take a second and consider subscribing, because what we're breaking down here isn't just behavior, it's patterns that repeat in almost every avoidant connection, and once you see it clearly, you stop falling into it the same way again. And the first reaction you almost always regret is the one that feels the most natural in the moment. You reach out more, you try to fix the distance with words, explanations, emotional honesty that you think will bring them back closer. You might send that long message trying to express everything at once, or you might do the opposite and start sending small signals just to test if they're still there. But what's happening underneath all of this is not communication, it's emotional urgency. It's your nervous system trying to restore safety by pulling the other person closer, even if pulling them closer is exactly what pushes them further away. And the painful irony is that while you're trying to save the connection, your reaction often becomes the very thing that increases the distance, not because you're wrong for feeling deeply, but because you're reacting from panic instead of stability. In that state, every action feels justified, but later, when things go quiet again, you're left replaying everything you did, wondering why it didn't work, and that's where the cycle starts to tighten around you. And the part that almost nobody explains clearly is why this behavior feels so personal when it usually isn't. When an avoidant pulls back, it can feel like rejection, like something about you triggered it, like you said too much or not enough or somehow failed to maintain whatever balance was there before. But what's often happening is far less about you and far more about their internal wiring around closeness and emotional intensity. For many avoidant patterns, closeness itself activates discomfort, not because the other person is wrong, but because intimacy feels like pressure, expectation, or loss of control. So when you start feeling their distance, your mind immediately translates it into self-blame, while their system is often just trying to regulate overwhelm. This mismatch creates a painful loop where one person pursues connection harder and the other steps back further, and both end up interpreting the other's behavior as proof of something negative, even though it's really just two different emotional systems colliding without understanding each other. And this is where the emotional trap begins to fully form without you even noticing it, because once that distance appears, your attachment system doesn't interpret it as neutral, it interprets it as threat. Not a logical threat, but an emotional one, the kind that triggers urgency, overthinking, and the need to restore connection immediately. Suddenly your thoughts stop being calm observations and start becoming spirals. You start analyzing tone, timing, patterns, past conversations. Everything becomes evidence for or against whether you still matter to them. And the more uncertain it feels, the more your brain tries to solve it, even when there is nothing concrete to solve. This is the point where you're no longer just in a relationship dynamic, you're inside a nervous system response that is trying to protect you, but ironically pushing you into actions that increase your distress. And beneath all of this, something very important is happening that most people never realize until later. Your nervous system is getting hijacked. It's not just overthinking in the casual sense, it's a biological response designed to detect disconnection and restore attachment. Your body starts behaving as if emotional distance is danger, which is why it feels so uncomfortable to simply do nothing. Stillness feels wrong, silence feels loud, waiting feels unbearable. So you act, you reach, you try to regain control through contact. But in doing so, you unknowingly reinforce the very dynamic that creates more instability. And the hardest truth in all of this is that the moment you understand this pattern is the exact moment you gain the ability to step out of it. Not by shutting your feelings off, but by learning not to let them drive every decision in real time. And once you see that nervous system response for what it is, something uncomfortable but important becomes clear. Most of the damage doesn't come from the other person pulling away, it comes from what you do in the first few hours after that shift. Because there's a very specific window where your emotions are at their peak intensity, where everything in you wants resolution right now, and in that window the choices you make tend to set the entire direction of the dynamic. The biggest mistake is believing that immediate action will create clarity, when in reality it usually creates more confusion. That's why the first thing you absolutely shouldn't do in the first 24 hours is try to force emotional resolution. No chasing, no emotional essays, no trying to decode their silence through indirect posts or testing behavior, and no attempts to lightly re-enter their attention just to see if they respond differently. Because in that heightened state, even your most well-intended message is not coming from clarity, it's coming from emotional pressure. And anything built on pressure rarely creates connection, it creates resistance. Instead, what feels counterintuitive but powerful is what silence actually does when it's used correctly. Not the kind of silence that is passive-aggressive or used to punish, and not the kind that comes from emotional shutdown, but the kind that is intentional enough to interrupt the cycle. Silence in this sense is not about winning anything or proving anything. It is about stopping the emotional escalation long enough for your system to settle back into itself. Because right now, every reaction is feeding a loop. Your urgency increases their distance increases your urgency, and the only way that loop breaks is when one side stops feeding it. Silence becomes the reset point, the space where your thoughts stop reacting to every imagined meaning and start returning to reality instead of fear-based interpretation. And in that space, something shifts that feels almost unfamiliar at first. You begin to feel your own presence again, not just the relationship noise in your head. And while you're in that silence, something else starts happening that most people completely miss. You begin to see what they actually notice when you stop reacting. At first, it may feel like nothing is changing on their side. No immediate apology, no sudden clarity, no emotional return. But underneath the surface, the dynamic is adjusting in ways that are not immediately visible. Because when someone is used to a pattern where distance is followed by pursuit, and suddenly that pursuit disappears, the emotional system on the other side registers the change even if it doesn't show it right away. Not necessarily as loss, but as difference. The pattern they were unconsciously relying on is no longer playing out in the same predictable way, and that unpredictability creates awareness even if it doesn't instantly create action. The key point here is not to assume what they are thinking, it's to understand that your lack of reaction removes the automatic script that both of you were stuck in. And this is where the difference between reacting and responding becomes the most important shift in the entire experience. A reaction is fast, emotional, and rooted in fear of disconnection. It tries to solve discomfort immediately, even if the solution is temporary. A response, on the other hand, is delayed enough to include awareness. It doesn't ignore emotion, but it also doesn't obey it blindly. Reaction says, "Fix this now or I will lose them," while response says, "I feel activated, but I don't need to act from this state." That distinction might sound small, but in real dynamics it completely changes the emotional tone of everything that follows, because reaction builds chaos and response builds stability, even if nothing else around you changes immediately. And the reason avoidant withdrawal feels so intense is because it often comes right after closeness, not instead of it. There's a specific emotional mechanism at play where intimacy creates a kind of internal pressure, and once that pressure reaches a certain threshold, withdrawal becomes a way to regain balance. It's not always conscious, and it's not always logical, but it follows a pattern. Closeness builds, emotional intensity rises, internal discomfort increases, and distance becomes a form of relief. So when you experience that sudden shift from warmth to coldness, it can feel like emotional whiplash because your system is still in connection mode while theirs has already moved into regulation mode. And without understanding this difference, both sides start misreading each other completely. One thinking, "I need more closeness to feel safe," the other thinking, "I need more distance to feel safe." And when these two survival strategies collide, something subtle but powerful happens. You become a mirror for each other's emotional patterns, your pursuit highlights their need for space, and their distance highlights your need for connection. Neither side is inherently wrong, but together they amplify each other's triggers. This is why the same relationship can feel deeply magnetic one moment and deeply destabilizing the next. It's not random, it's a feedback loop. And once you see that mirror effect clearly, it becomes harder to take every shift personally, because you start recognizing that what feels like rejection is often just activation between two nervous systems trying to regulate themselves in opposite ways. And once you understand that mirror effect, something even more powerful becomes available to you, the realization that the entire dynamic only continues as long as both sides keep playing their assigned roles. The pursuer and the distancer, the one who reaches and the one who retreats, the one who over-explains and the one who goes quiet. It feels personal when you're inside it, but structurally it's predictable. And that's why one of the most silent yet powerful shifts you can make is choosing not to keep performing your role in the same automatic way. Not through games, not through pretending you don't care, but through something far more grounded. Redirecting your energy back into your own life in a way that is actually real. Not a distraction, not a temporary escape, but a genuine return to yourself. Because when your focus stops revolving around tracking their emotional availability and starts rebuilding your own internal stability, the entire emotional equation begins to change. You are no longer just a reaction point in someone else's pattern, you become a person with a direction again. And this is where something subtle but noticeable begins to happen. When you stop reacting, not as a strategy but as a natural consequence of regaining your own emotional center, the way your absence is perceived starts to shift. It is not about disappearing or trying to create longing through distance. It's about no longer being constantly available to the emotional push and pull cycle. In the beginning, this might feel uncomfortable because your mind is still conditioned to equate engagement with security. But slowly there is a recalibration. You stop checking for signs every few minutes, you stop interpreting silence as a message, and instead of your energy flowing outward in constant anticipation, it starts folding back into your own experiences, your routines, your focus, your clarity. And in that state, something changes in how you carry yourself emotionally, even if nothing external has changed yet. And now comes one of the hardest contrasts to accept, but also one of the most important. What happens when you chase versus what happens when you don't. When you chase, even if it comes from love, the emotional field becomes saturated with urgency. Every message carries weight. Every silence feels like rejection. Every response is overanalyzed. The connection becomes fragile because it is constantly being tested, constantly being pushed for confirmation. And over time, that creates exhaustion on both sides. But when you don't chase, when you allow space without collapsing into panic-driven action, the dynamic shifts into something unfamiliar. At first, it feels like loss because you are no longer actively trying to maintain proximity, but over time, clarity begins to replace confusion. You start seeing the relationship not just through emotion but through pattern, and in that clarity, you finally get to observe whether there is real consistency or just intermittent connection that only survives under pressure. And this leads into a much harder truth about compatibility that most people avoid acknowledging while they are still emotionally attached. Not every connection that feels intense is meant to become stable. Some dynamics are built around emotional contrast rather than emotional alignment. One person moves toward closeness when they feel safe, the other moves away when they feel close, and both are unintentionally reinforcing each other's deepest fears. And no amount of effort can fully convert a mismatch in emotional regulation into effortless security. That doesn't mean growth is impossible, but it does mean that both people have to actively participate in changing the pattern, not just one person carrying the emotional responsibility while the other stays unchanged. And recognizing this is not about giving up on people, it's about finally being honest about what kind of emotional experience you are actually living in instead of what you hope it will become. And when you reach this level of awareness, the real challenge is no longer understanding the other person, it becomes managing yourself when your own emotions are pulling you in every direction at once. Because even when you know the pattern, even when you understand the psychology behind it, your body can still react as if nothing has changed. That's why staying calm is not about suppressing emotion, but about learning how to sit with activation without immediately converting it into action. It means noticing the urge to reach out without obeying it instantly. It means allowing discomfort to exist without turning it into a message, a confrontation, or a reaction. And slowly over time, your system learns something new, that emotional intensity does not always require immediate resolution, that feeling strongly does not mean you must act strongly, and that pause, the space between feeling and reacting, is where your power actually returns. And in that space, something begins to stabilize that once felt impossible. The constant urgency starts to soften, the need for immediate answers loses some of its grip, And instead of being pulled around by every shift in someone else's behavior, you start building a quieter kind of strength, the ability to observe without collapsing, to care without chasing, and to remain grounded even when clarity is not instantly available. This is the point where the entire experience stops being just about them and starts becoming about you reclaiming emotional control that was never truly gone, just overwhelmed. And once that quiet strength starts to take root, there's a moment where everything that once felt chaotic begins to look different, not because the other person has suddenly changed, but because your relationship to the situation has. What used to feel like emotional emergency starts to feel like information. Their distance is no longer a signal that demands immediate action. It becomes a data point that you can observe without collapsing into it, and that shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because now, instead of being inside the storm, you're standing just far enough outside of it to see the pattern repeating itself without getting pulled under every wave. This is where emotional independence begins, not when you stop caring, but when caring no longer controls your decisions in real time. And if reconnection ever happens, this is where discernment becomes your most important tool. Because not every return is the same, even if it looks similar on the surface. Some returns come with clarity, accountability, and a noticeable shift in behavior that shows emotional growth has actually taken place. But others come from discomfort, loneliness, or the simple reactivation of a familiar bond that still operates under the same old pattern. And the difference is not always visible in words, it is visible in consistency, in whether the same cycle begins again shortly after, or whether something genuinely feels more stable, more paced, more mutual. And the version of you that has gone through this shift is no longer reacting to the emotional high of someone returning. You are observing structure now, not just emotion. You are paying attention to whether actions match presence, not just whether words sound comforting in the moment. And that leads into a new standard that quietly begins to form within you, even if you don't announce it to anyone. You stop treating confusion as something you have to endure in order to keep a connection alive. You stop normalizing emotional inconsistency as something you just have to adjust to. Because once you've seen the cycle clearly, once you've felt how draining it is to constantly self-regulate around someone else's unpredictability, you can no longer unsee it. And this doesn't make you cold, it makes you precise. You begin valuing clarity over intensity, consistency over chemistry that only shows up in bursts, and emotional safety over emotional guessing games. And slowly, without force, your tolerance for uncertainty in relationships starts to shrink, not out of fear, but out of self-respect. And perhaps the most important shift in all of this is what happens inside you when the urge to react finally loses its dominance. There will still be moments when something triggers you, when silence feels heavy again, when old patterns try to pull you back into urgency. But instead of immediately responding, there's now a small gap that didn't exist before, a pause, a moment where you notice the feeling without becoming it. And in that pause, you regain something that was always yours but often overshadowed: choice. Because the truth is, emotional control was never about eliminating feelings. It was about creating enough space between feeling and action that you are no longer trapped inside automatic behavior. And every time you choose not to react from panic, you are not just avoiding a mistake, you are actively rewiring the way you relate to emotional discomfort. And as this new way of responding settles in, there is a final realization that brings everything together in a way that feels both grounding and slightly sobering. You start to understand that healing in these dynamics is not about finally getting a different reaction from someone else. It is about no longer abandoning yourself in response to their reaction at all. Because the real turning point is not when they change or when they come back differently or when clarity is finally given to you from the outside. The real turning point is when your internal stability stops depending on any of that, when your emotional state is no longer outsourced to someone who is inconsistent with it. When your peace is no longer something that arrives only when everything is going right between you and someone else, but something you actively maintain regardless of their behavior. And that is the final shift this entire experience was pointing toward all along. Not detachment in the sense of not caring, but detachment in the sense of no longer being controlled. You can still feel deeply, still connect, still hope for something real, but you no longer lose yourself in the process. You no longer chase clarity at the cost of your dignity. You no longer confuse anxiety for love. Instead, you learn to observe, to pause, to respond rather than react, and to recognize when a connection is aligned with your emotional safety and when it is simply activating your fear of loss. And once that awareness is fully in place, even if the same patterns show up again in your life, you will no longer enter them the same way. because the version of you that reacts from panic is no longer the one leading your decisions.